Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 virtual pilgrimage to Yosemite, the Yosemite pilgrimage. This is the 8th year that we're having this pilgrimage to commemorate the contributions of Chinese Americans to the building of the Sierra Nevada and Yosemite National Park. And I'm so happy that we're so able to have this pilgrimage, even though we're in this pandemic crisis. And large thanks to the National Parks and Conservation Association for hosting this event. Large thanks to the National Park Service for working with us to make this pilgrimage so successful. And of course, the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, which is also another host. So this pilgrimage has been an important part of changing the narrative of the stories we can tell in Yosemite National Park, as well as the Sierra Nevada. And I'm so happy that this year we're able to hold this event with a great number of speakers and a nice program that I hope you'll enjoy for the next hour. This pilgrimage has meant a lot to me and many other people who have been involved over the last 8 years, and it's inspired myself and others to do more to help our national parks, help the organizations that support it, and make these parks be important legacies and storytellers for our country. So with that, I'm going to go on because I know we have a full program and don't want to say anymore and go with our next section. And that's going to involve a group of great speakers: Eugene Moy, Yan Chang, Annette Pimentel, and Rich Lowe, a great artist. So Eugene, you want to go ahead and start your introduction about the Historical Society?
Great. Thank you very much, Jack. I appreciate the opportunity to share a little history with you. I'd like to extend greetings to everyone on behalf of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. We're a nonprofit based in LA. We're dedicated to discovering the history of the early Chinese and the building of our country. Since our founding in 1975, we have organized school programs, speaker presentations, we've conducted community walking tours, and we publish books on Chinese American history. We also seek out our heritage by organizing trips to historic places like to San Francisco and the Gold Rush country. We go to historic mining towns along the California coast. We go to the Golden Spike Transcontinental Railroad site in Utah. We go to historic communities like Marysville and Riverside, Chinatowns, and to Hawaii and Mexico, where early Chinese laborers and entrepreneurs established a new life here. Since 2013, as Jack mentioned, we've been working with Jack Shu and representatives of the National Park Service and the National Parks Conservation Association on an annual pilgrimage to Yosemite National Park. We encamp at Yosemite in cabins and tents. We hike historic roads and trails built by Chinese. We listen to talks by rangers, historians, and archaeologists. Shout out to archaeologists, by the way. I see a few of them online. Enjoy the magnificent natural landscape. And since it's going to be over 90 degrees here in Southern California today, I'm wishing for a nice waterfall to dip my toes in and soak myself. And we share lots of mountain cooking and fellowship. All of this is followed by an optional backpacking trip to Sing Peak. And now I'm going to get out of the way and let the real experts, the storytellers and the artists, share Yosemite through their eyes. And so I'd like to next introduce Yan Chan, park ranger, and she has a great story for you.
Thank you, Jean Moy. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so although we're here together virtually, I want us to imagine us standing together in Yosemite National Park. So next slide. Next slide.
Yan, you're on mute. Oh.
Yes. Can you unmute me?
You're on now.
Okay. Could you back up to my first slide?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to thank Jean Moy, and although we're here virtually together by computer screen, I want us to imagine us standing on this incredible bridge in Tuolumne Meadows, and we're listening to the river, we're under blue skies, a cool mountain breeze is blowing, and we're here together to celebrate the contributions of Chinese in Yosemite. Next slide. Well, who were the Chinese that worked in Yosemite? We don't actually have that many stories from the hundreds and hundreds of Chinese, such as a picture here of Chinese working in the Sierra Nevada. But we do have some secondhand accounts from the people that knew some specific Chinese. Next slide. For example, in the very southern end of the park in Wawona, there was a family called the Washburn family that owned the Wawona Hotel for many, many years, from the mid-1800s to the early 1930s. And they have so many accounts and stories of their Chinese staff. Over 20 of them worked for them. And in this picture, you have a picture of the head cook, Ayu, who worked for 47 seasons, and Alui, who followed after Ayu as the head chef at the Wawona Hotel. Next slide. We also know a lot about another incredible cook. And to start off our pilgrimage this year, we're going to learn a lot more about a person named Tai Sing. Next slide. Can you advance? So Tai Sing spent quite a lot of time in Yosemite and throughout the mountains. And he cooked for the U.S. Geological Survey, which was mapping all throughout California. And there is a peak that was named for Tai Sing. It's a 10,552 feet peak right on the park boundary. Our next speaker, Annette Bay Pimentel, is someone that came to the park after she published this book called Mountain Chef in the Centennial of the National Park Service, 2016. And I met Annette online through corresponding about Tai Sing because we both were researching Tai Sing. And she came and gave a talk, and 2 days later, next slide, along with other pilgrimage members, we actually hiked to the very top of Sing Peak. So it's my pleasure to introduce Annette Bay Pimentel, who is going to be our first speaker about her book, Mountain Chef, followed by the illustrator Rich Lowe.
Thank you, Yan Yan. So I first came to the story of Tai Sing. I write picture books for young readers about people who are not very well known in American history. And I first came to the story of Tai Sing when I was researching something else. And I saw a black and white photo from 1915 that had a beautiful banquet table with snowy white linen and fine china on it, and it was outdoors. And standing next to it was a Chinese American man wearing an apron. And I wondered, who is he and what is he doing? So if you can advance the slide, Dennis. My scurry down that research rabbit hole ended up filling my life for months. And it culminated in this picture book, which I wrote with generous consultations and advice from Yan Yan and other people who were on this call. Now, Tai Sing was a great trail cook, a great trail chef, I think you could say, but his trail cooking was far from hot dogs on a stick. So I'd like to read you a passage from my book. Can you advance it, please? Tai Sing planned. He mulled over menus for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 30 people for 10 days in the wilderness. Lyonnaise potatoes, peaches and cream, frog's legs, English plum pudding with brandy sauce. And if you can advance it. Given that style of cooking, it is not surprising that Tai Sing came to the attention of Stephen T. Mather, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Interior. Mather was planning a glamour camping or a glamping trip to line up lobbyists to help him get the National Park Service Act passed. And Tai Sing was the caterer that he hired. And if you can advance it. Tyson, of course, did an amazing job with the food, which was obvious even in this, the first photo that I ever saw. But even more remarkably, Tyson adopted Mather's vision as his own and invented his own creative ways to help the lobbying effort. So as I was writing this book, the major challenge was finding a way to research someone who was seen at the time that he lived as peripheral to the main action. Luckily for me, the Bancroft Library at Berkeley holds many accounts of the people on this trip that included references to Tyson, and even more importantly, it holds many photographs that the campers took on this trip and on one in the following year. If you can advance it. I'd like to share with you a couple of photos that Bancroft Library has given me permission to share in public presentation. This one is a photo of Tyson with the folding sheet metal stove that he used to cook all of his meals. I especially love in this photo that we get a glimpse of the boxes, the bags, the pots, the pans, the crates, everything he had to take along with him for his pop-up wilderness kitchen. And if you can advance it. And of course, that wilderness kitchen had to be entirely mobile so that he could move from camping site to camping site. Here is Tyson with his fully packed mule. Now, nestled in there, close to the mule's hide, where we can't see it, is Tyson's sourdough starter, bubbling away and growing in the sun against the mule's body warmth. From that sourdough start, Tyson would produce his famous sourdough rolls at every meal. Now, this glamping trip that Mather had planned did not go smoothly. One day, one of the mules, which was packed with many of the gourmet foods that Tyson had brought along, the mule wandered away and it never was recovered. I want to read to you from the book about another disaster that happened the very next day. If you can advance it. Tyson tied the mule's ropes with extra care. He didn't want another mule wandering away. The trail along Rattlesnake Creek was narrow and steep. Tyson stepped carefully, loose rocks shifting and crunching underfoot. He took it slow, but one mule drifted too close to the edge. Go forward. Clatter, clang, crash. The mule tumbled off the trail and down the cliff. Boxes burst and bags flew open. Utensils and food flew through the air. At the bottom, the mule shook itself and scrambled back up. It was fine, but the food and gear were not. And if you advance it. At 9 o'clock that night, Tyson stumbled into camp with battered boxes and bent knives and bruised apples he'd salvaged. His sourdough was lost somewhere in the dusty gravel at the bottom of the cliff. No more rolls light as clouds. Mather and the other campers had been waiting for hours. They were ravenous. What could Tyson feed them? He had to make new plans and fast. And if you can advance it. I'm actually going to leave you hanging in suspense in hopes that you'll turn to the book to find out how Tyson solved that problem. I think it's important to remember that Stephen T. Mather didn't create the National Park Service all by himself. His vision was enacted by many people, often marginalized people like Tyson. And that's an important story for kids and for all of us, that our nation's beloved institutions were created by communities and that those communities belong to all of us. Tyson is truly an American hero. One of the wonderful things about being a picture book author is that I get paired with talented artists and get to watch them make my words spring to life. My publisher, Charles Bridge, selected Rich Lowe to make the incredible art for our book. Rich works as a fine artist and a graphic artist, as well as doing illustration work. When I first saw the art that he created, I was just stunned by all the color. I was so used to looking at black and white photos. He's remarkable in the way he uses source material and is true to the source material without mimicking the source material. And I'd like to pass the baton on to Rich to tell you a little bit about the process of making art for this book.
Thank you, Annette, for a great introduction. I'm going to turn on my camera so you can see my face. I was excited when I received the Mountain Chef assignment from Charles Bridge. Being Chinese American, I felt there was a heritage connection. I was anxious to read Annette's manuscript and explore Taising and his story. After reading the story, I started to break down the scenes that were to be illustrated. With extensive experience in illustrating stories, it wasn't long before the scenes were mapped out, using key sentences and partnered with imagination. The task was made easy by Annette's providing substantial amount of historical references relevant to the story. I was able to use this reference to create the diner scene, image A and A1 and A2. And as Annette had spoke about the scene, I don't want to imitate the scene. I want to interpret it so we can continue the storytelling. And part of the reason why that I took some creative liberty in colors and creating a illuminated scene, a night scene, and using watercolor, which is very challenging. So in the beginning, the publisher would want to cover illustration as the first thing they want to see. They needed to start the marketing strategies. The first sketch was rejected. Next scene. The first sketch was rejected because the editor thought it was too realistic. I basically used the photo and trying to create a sketch from it. And the editor wanted an imaginative character, not a realistic rendering of Taising. The new sketches were exactly what they wanted. Next scene, please. As I recreating what I thought Taising would look like in my head, and based on the children's book parameter for illustrations, and they came out perfect. The tone was set for the interior illustrations. The technique I use is a combination of pencils and transparent watercolor washes. Drawings were done on tracing paper because I like the textures. Next scene, please. I didn't want the drawing to be refined. And the reason is that your first impression in your head, and when you're sketching these drawings, they are the freshest. And I tend not to touch whatever I see first. The scanned watercolor washes, the next scene, please, were strategically placed to optimize the effect of the transparencies. The result were dynamic and vibrant. Another important element was dramatization. The scene with the donkey, the next scene, please. Okay, go back. So the scene on the far left corner, bottom corner. And that one of my favorite was a camp scene, which is right next to that picture, where the illumination from the fire and the light was just perfect. Okay, next scene, please. The final scene was as important as the cover. Taising is portrayed here as a fitted man who's off to another adventure as the mountain chef. And my impression of this book 4 years later, was as fresh as a memory when I first illustrated for this book. So I still enjoy in my head and in my heart the drawings, the process of reading Annette's manuscript and creating the drawings And I'm very happy how the book came out. So now I will end my segment and toss it back to Yan Yan Chen, Ranger for Yosemite National Park.
Wow. Oh.
Thank you, Rich Lowe. I'm going to introduce the next section, and I'll be followed by Yosemite National Park's Chief of Interpretation and Education, Sabrina Diaz. This has been a project called the Chinese Laundry Building Project, and we're really excited to share this project with the public very soon. So you're going to get a little sneak peek about what the exhibit's all about. Next slide. Just as background, I wanted to give you a little bit of perspective if you've never been to Yosemite. Yosemite is a park roughly the size of Rhode Island. It's 1,200 square miles, and most people that come to Yosemite come to this very center of the park called Yosemite Valley, where we have famous landmarks like Half Dome. But the park has a real diversity of plant life, wildlife, and an elevational range that ranges from 2,000 feet above sea level to over 13,000 feet above sea level. So visitors will come to the park, and if they visit Yosemite Valley and they have extra time, there are all these other areas that are just incredible in their beauty, and you can learn a lot from these different areas. And one area in the southern end of the park is called Wawona. Next slide. In Wawona, we have one of our 3 giant sequoia groves, the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias, and there's a hotel called the Wawona Hotel. Next slide. The Wawona Hotel has been there since the early days of the park. Even before it was a protected area in 1864, there was a smaller hotel called Clark Station. Next slide. And in the mid-1800s, around 1860s, 1870s, it became the hotel that we know today. It's developed and modernized since then. But during the 1880s to the 1930s, the Washburn family owned this hotel, and they hired about 20 Chinese staff to help them. So there are some buildings that they had for the Chinese, and only one exists today. It's the Chinese Laundry Building. Next slide. Next to the laundry, it's not there anymore, but there was the Chinese bunkhouse. Next slide. And right next to the laundry was this boiler house where they would have steam and be able to create all that hot water and steam to do the ironing for all the hotel guests. Next slide. During one of our pilgrimages, we had a tour from our cultural anthropologist who brought us to the Chinese Laundry Building, which at the time was being used as a storage area. It was used as a carriage shop and then became a storage area that we got a chance to explore. And as a result of that pilgrimage experience, Sabrina Diaz really spearheaded this idea that we needed to convert this into a Chinese laundry exhibit for the public. Next slide. So this is how it looks today. Next slide. And last summer, with the help of a lot of park staff and the historic preservation crew, they were able to clear this area, and it's now this open space that we are going to fill with the stories of the Chinese who worked in Yosemite. And I want to thank a family who contributed a generous gift to the Yosemite Conservancy, the Wang Yi family, who live in Wawona, who have a home there, and has many generations of living in this park. And Sabrina will talk more about this family, but I want to thank them for making this possible for us to have an exhibit. Next slide. So I'm going to share with you really briefly, what are we going to tell in the exhibit? And we're going to start when you first enter, learning about why the Chinese came to California. In 1848 was the year when many more Chinese arrived, and that was when gold was discovered here in California. Next slide. They worked really hard alongside other miners from all over the world. This is a quote from a person who observed them. Right after they arrived, he said, "The Chinese are industrious people. And if a large number could be introduced into California, landed property would increase in value fourfold. Next slide. But soon it became difficult to mine. There were some difficult taxes called the foreign miners tax, and Chinese were pushed away from mining. So they looked for other types of work, and they developed vegetable gardens, farmland, and they provided fresh vegetables to mining camps throughout the West. Next slide. They also cooked in the mining areas. This is a beautiful painting by an artist named Mian Si-tu. Next slide. And probably what they're most well known for today is that they worked on the Central Pacific Railroad, building the road across the Sierra Nevada range. And this was one of the hardest parts of the railroad. By 1865, the Chinese comprised about 2/3 of the labor. They used picks and wheelbarrows and carts, and through human labor, helped to make this possible, this railroad possible. Next slide. They also brought innovations and techniques to the building of the railroad. Another painting by Mian Si-tu shows a picture of what it must have looked like when they built this railroad through this really difficult mountainous terrain. And we'll learn more about that later on in this pilgrimage with the film, a short trailer, which Hilda will introduce later. Next slide. But throughout their work here, they faced quite a lot of adversity. There was a huge amount of racism against the Chinese because they were working so hard. And there was laws that were passed. There were laws that helped to create this difficulty of them living in this country. For a while, they couldn't testify in the courts. And even if they were born in this country, they were not considered US citizens. And that was brought all the way to the Supreme Court when finally it was decided that they are US citizens if they're born here. Well, one of the worst things that happened to the Chinese that came here was a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was from 1882 all the way to 1943, which prevented the immigration of a lot of Chinese to come to this country to work here. Next slide. It was in this backdrop of difficulty that they came and worked in Yosemite. I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is a quick map of the early roads in Yosemite. But even though it's a two-dimensional map, you have to imagine that they were building roads through thousands of feet of mountains, going up and down granite areas, difficult trees, forests. The next slide. So our next part of the exhibit, the second section, we'll talk about them as the road builders. Next slide. They built a road from Wawona in the south all the way to Yosemite Valley in just 4.5 months in the middle of the winter. And that climbed 3,000 vertical feet up and down the mountain. Next slide. During the winter, the Mariposa Gazette, the local newspaper, wrote, "The newly projected road leading from the South Fork of the Merced River to the Yosemite Valley is being pushed forward with a determined zeal and energy, having at this time upwards of 100 men engaged upon the work." Next slide. Today you can walk part of that road. This is still this rock wall. They have walls throughout the park that are still standing the test of time. And this is during the winter when we walked on this road. Next slide. The other major road that they worked on is along the road, Tioga Road. It's 56.5 miles, and it was called the Great Sierra Wagon Road. Amazingly, they also finished this 56.5-mile road in just 130 working days, about 4.5 months. Next slide. And this road crosses into the highest part of the park's road system, right up to Tuolumne Meadows, and outside the park, Tioga Pass, which is just under 10,000 feet above sea level. Next slide. So these are just some of the pictures along that road, right by the river, Tenaya Lake, right here, where there's incredible rock work that they had to build in order to make the roadbed firm along the river. Along the lake. Next slide. And this is near Tioga Pass, this high mountain area, where there was a mining town, which is the reason why we had this road originally built. Next slide. And Tioga Pass. Next slide. The third section of our exhibit will talk about the Chinese and their role in the hotels throughout the park. So not just in Wawona, they also had a large role in Yosemite Valley, where there were many hotels. but we're going to preserve the story of how they made the experience of these early guests in the park an incredible experience. Next slide. So the Chinese Laundry Building, even though we don't have any, or we haven't found any pictures of what it looked like inside, this is a picture of a Chinese laundry in Honolulu in 1914. And our current laundry building was rebuilt, the one that's standing, in 1917 to replace an older Chinese laundry building. So I want to read a passage from Wawona Washburn Hartwig, who grew up as the daughter of the managers of the Wawona Hotel. And she said this: "In the busy part of the summer, there would be 4 or 5 working in the laundry. Everything about the work interested me, but none so much as the ironing. Sheets and towels came off the mangle as slick as glass, and I watched with admiration as Yi or Aoi personally handled the finished work, the delicate blouses, dresses, and shirts of the guests." Next slide. We also will talk about the famous cooks. So Ayu, I mentioned briefly. He worked there for 47 seasons, and he cooked for 4 presidents, and was an incredible cook that people would rave about. Even the presidents who he met would come into the kitchen and shake Ayu's hand. Next slide. And then the cook Tai Sing, which Annette Bay Pimentel introduced, and an incredible role they had cooking for the Stephen Ting Mather Mountain Party, which, as a result of the experience in the mountains, including Tai Sing's incredible cooking, they all went out and promoted the idea of a national park service. And within a year and a half of Stephen Mather taking on this job, and 1 year after this first Mather Mountain Party trip, we formed the National Park Service in 1916. Next slide. And this is a picture of Tai Sing cooking for the Mather Mountain Party. Next slide. The final part of the exhibit is going to talk about bridging the past with the present and the future. And one of the things that has been an outcome of these pilgrimages is meeting people who are celebrating this history from all different generations. And we want to share the story of the St. Pete pilgrimage, as well as these pilgrimages that have been happening for 8 years now, but also to continue these stories so people who visit the park can learn about this incredible history. Next slide. I think it's really important the national parks are here today because we can share these cultural stories. It's important for people to learn about our park's history and also the country's history. And I think that this is a great opportunity that we have today to share this part of our country's past, but also why it's so relevant for us today. So I want to introduce our Chief of Interpretation and Education, Sabrina Diaz, who will talk more about the Chinese Laundry Project.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me be part of the pilgrimage once again this year. Before I jump into my first slide, I will just say that I came to Yosemite 5 years ago and had the wonderful pleasure of joining the first pilgrimage 4 years ago, and haven't done the hike all the way to St. Pete yet, but one day. I think one of the things I fondly remember in my first pilgrimage was showing up with my daughter and my mom. It was a weekend, my mom was visiting, and I thought I was just gonna come just to kind of get a sense of what we were doing. And what I found was that I was welcomed by just some of the kindest people that I've had the chance to meet in Yosemite, who invited me to stay for dinner despite me having nothing to contribute to the potluck, and just such a really welcoming environment. So thank you. I feel like this has been one of my most favorite partnerships to work with, and it really is because of the kindness and graciousness of all the people that I've met over the years. When I attended that first pilgrimage 4 years ago, as Yan Yan was showing a slide earlier, we went to a building that I had only known as the Chinese, or the carriage shop, excuse me. And what I knew at that time was that that area of Wawona was an area that my staff interpreters told the pioneer history story. It was my first year, so I was still learning a lot. And later on, I ended up looking at documents about how this area came to life and realized it was the creation of the chief of interpretation in the 1960s, who decided that we should really preserve buildings and tell the story of Anglo-American history that is literally still in some of our documents today in our cultural landscape inventory reports. And when I went to this building and we walked through it, the first thing I noticed was just the how we were using it as a storage area. And I'll go into that in a little bit more. And through that experience, we decided, myself and collectively with the Chinese Historical Society and the folks who were on the pilgrimage that year, that this was a really perfect spot to tell the story of Chinese American contributions in Yosemite. So I want to walk you through just some of our overarching goals for this space so that you understand what we're doing in the area and to the building. And so I think most importantly, what we're trying to do is restore an important untold story that we had in Yosemite National Park. Yan was very proactive in telling the story, but as a division and as a park, we were not proactively telling the story. In fact, I would consider it a story that was lost, and lost in the sense that we turned that building into a carrot shop, a place to rehab stagecoaches, and then we were using it as a storage unit. So we clearly were not realizing the importance of this space. And I think the National Park Service in the last 15 years that I have been a part of it, I have seen just this incredible shift of us trying to realize that there are all these stories that we have not been telling, and we haven't been doing justice to the incredible contributions of all different people of cultural backgrounds and ethnicities and race. So I think that's our number one goal with this project. Of course, celebrate the rich contributions of Chinese Americans in Yosemite, and really acknowledge the disparity and the adversity that Chinese immigrants experienced in the development of Yosemite National Park. I'm sure many of you have heard dialogue of agencies like the Park Service and museums really trying to focus on telling a more inclusive story that offers multiple perspectives and tells a very balanced set of stories. And so we don't want to ignore some of the challenges and some of the clear gaps and disparity that we had in Yosemite at that time. Other design elements for the space specifically is it's a historic building. It's actually, while all the other buildings in the Pioneer History Center were moved to that location, the Chinese Laundry is actually one of the only buildings that was originally built there and still stands there today. So we have to be really careful about what we're designing so that we're not altering the historic structure or causing any damage. You may have seen in the photo that Yan showed, the paint doesn't necessarily all match up very well. And we're leaving it like that because quite frankly, we want to be able to do some more work in the space and figure out how do we get down to the original layer of paint? What was the original color that was in there? Was it even painted for that matter? So there's still a lot of work that we want to do. Which differs from some of the early dialogues we had where I was like, I want this painted and I want it to look fresh and be inviting, and just working through that process of what does it mean to actually maintain the integrity of a historic structure. We want to design exhibits that are movable. This is a great space where I think that the Chinese Historical Society, and as we continue with these pilgrimages, we might be able to have dinner there one day, or maybe there's a meeting that we're going to have in there. And so I want to be able to create this place that is not just for visitors with exhibits, but a space that we collectively feel is ours. And that way we can use it in different ways. And as new ideas come to fruition, we have this flexibility to think about this space in different contexts. And then lastly, design an exhibit that allows for really high visitor engagement. I think as we tell these untold stories, there's this wonderful opportunity to engage visitors in deeper dialogue rather than just walking into a space, reading a few panels and leaving. And so as you'll see in some of the designs I'm going to show you, we're really looking at ways that we can engage people to actually sit down and maybe have a conversation with the people that they're traveling with, or maybe have a conversation with a ranger or an intern or whoever we have in that space at any given time. So really looking to just create not a quick visit, but a little bit more of a deeper, more meaningful experience. Next slide, please. So this is some of the work that has happened already. So our first step really was to clean out the space. I wish that for those of you that were there, you probably remember distinctly. And if you weren't there, I want you to envision walking into this space and finding barely a space to walk. It was filled with a stagecoach and other museum items. It was filled with wood that we wanted to keep for future projects. It was filled with outdated equipment that we had used for the carriage shop. And everything that was on the ground was also covered with, I swear, at least a foot of dust. And other things like rodent excrement. The building had not been cared for. And I remember being so excited when I was about to walk into this space, and then I walked in and felt incredibly embarrassed, quite frankly, because I was the acting chief of interpretation at the time, and realizing that, wow, here is this story, and this by walking into that space and finding it look like that, that was a really big statement about us not recognizing the importance of that building. So we recruited lots of volunteers, and we spent several days taking every item out of the space, de-hantavirusing the entire space so that we could continue to work in there safely. Things have been added over the years to accommodate repairing stagecoaches. So we removed an HVAC system, the electrical was not working very well, and the building, because it wasn't deemed as important for us, had not been stabilized or repaired in a really long time. So we have this incredible historic preservation crew here at Yosemite National Park who spent several weeks going tooth and nail through the building, replacing siding, replacing parts of the roof, completely redoing the porch. And also what they just did actually last week was worked on an ADA accessible parking spot and pathway. There is not a trail that leads there right now. It's on the side of a not very busy road. And so we're trying to work on that as well, but we at least wanted to make sure that if someone couldn't walk up this quiet road, that we do have an ADA accessible parking spot and pathway to get in. We also removed a closet and replaced windows that were broken and needed to be replaced. And right now you can see in that lower corner photo, LED or lighting, not LED lighting, but fluorescent lighting. Thankfully, that is easy to remove. They're just hanging on hooks. And so we're gonna pull that down. We're actually gonna put some more vintage historical looking lighting in that space. So, and that will come with the designs. So let me walk you through what we are envisioning right now for the slides. So next slide, please. So another painting by me and Situ, which is awesome. Yeah, and I didn't realize that yours were the same artist in your presentation. But we've been given permission to use this photo, and I just love this photo. As Yan Yan mentioned, we have not been able to track down a photo of the Chinese laundry when it was in use as a laundry facility. We've put out calls on social media, and we still haven't gotten anything back yet. And so in the interim, until we can find a really high quality photo, one day we found this beautiful image, and the artist has agreed to allow us to use it in our exhibit. So when you walk into this space, this is going to be a very large scale image, probably 6 to 8 feet wide. And it's going to help us to divide the room a little bit to create some more spaces. So this will be hanging from the ceiling, and it will kind of come down in the middle of the room, dividing the room. So that way, when you walk in, you get this incredible sense of what this space was and looked like. This wonderful element that one of our seasonal employees, Heather Vandergritten, came up with was, why don't we hang laundry from the ceiling above this beautiful image? So we're gonna put some lines up and put some towels and sheets and other things hanging above this beautiful image. And then below the image, we are looking at other things that we can do, like having some models of irons. We potentially have a stove that is sitting outside the facility that we believe was actually probably inside the building when it was a laundry facility. So we're looking at getting that cleaned up and blasted and potentially brought inside to the space as well. So just again, really giving people that sense of what this space looked like. But I think in addition to telling the actual history of the building itself, this is one of the richest places where we can tell the greater picture, like Yan Yan was describing, of all of the incredible contributions that Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans have made in Yosemite over the years. So if we go to our next slide, you'll see the next section. So one of our other sections will be looking at Chinese builders, and this will be just designed as kind of a normal panel that you would find in a museum or an exhibit hall. There'll be some image and text. But then the cart that you see in the lower left corner is actually a museum object that we have not ever had out on display. And so we're going to use this Chinese cart as part of the exhibit as something three-dimensional that visitors can see and look at and start to understand the story a little bit better. All right, next slide. Apologize for the blurriness of this photo, but this is just one of my most favorite photos. We've seen it several times already in today's presentation, and I think it resonates with so many of us. But what we want to do is, of course, create another section within this building that tells the story of Chinese chefs in Yosemite. And we will be telling the story of IU. There'll be a panel and an exhibit for that. But this image, once again, like the Chinese laundry, we are going to create a very large image of this that also hangs from the ceiling against one of the walls. It'll probably be, again, 6 to 8 feet, probably more than 8 feet wide, and hang down, 3/4 of the way down. And then what we're going to do, I want you to imagine if you're standing in front of this giant image, pretty much almost where you see the log where they're sitting, we're going to recreate the scene. So we're going to have a dinner table set up that is also 6 feet in length with the white linen, with plates and, table utensils, just as you're seeing in the image right now. We're going to create some very natural looking seating, and we're going to invite people to sit down at this table. Instead of using real porcelain, we're going to use plastic porcelain plates that sometimes you see at weddings when people are having an outdoor wedding. And on each of the plates, we are going to write an essential question that we're going to ask visitors to sit down with the people they're traveling with and ask that question to them and recreate the kinds of rich conversations that happened around the dinner table during the Mather party. And also the kinds of rich conversations that we all have with family and friends around the dinner table. And so we want to use that as this way to connect, again, the past to the present, where, this idea of food and good friends and family is this wonderful way that creates memories, I think, for every one of us, regardless of your race or ethnicity or backgrounds. This idea of coming together around a dinner table is communal for all of us. We're also going to create some of the, some of the plates that you'll see. So we're going to have like a dish that's a pie dish, and we're going to talk about the apple pie that IU would create, or that Tai Sing would serve. So there'll be all these little tidbits on the table that people can physically touch and learn about why those dinners were so good, what made them so special. So we'll have quotes and other things on the table. All right, next slide. And then, as Yan mentioned, that last part will be really connecting the past to the present. I think sometimes when we tell the story of the past, we leave the story in the past. And we see this quite often in our interpretation with Native tribes, where there's this myth that tribes don't exist anymore, right? They're not connected to the park. It's a story that lives in the past. And for me, that's something I'm really aware of, and want visitors to walk away knowing that it's not a story that lives in the past. It's a story and history that is being created today. This call is part of our history of how Chinese Americans are connecting to public lands and places like Yosemite. The building that they are in is a modern story. So really just helping them understand all of the amazing work that's happened 1940s and 50s and 60s and all the way up to today that are still continuing to connect Chinese Americans to our park and to our public lands. All right, and next slide. And I think finally, I would just like to close with thanking everybody who has been a part of this. Yan already mentioned the incredible donation from the Wang Yi family, and that has been really special to us. It was The donation covered all of the work that needs to happen to the structure, and that the connection that the Wang Yi family has to Wamona in the park, I think just makes this story richer as people who have been in Yosemite since 1953. Also just want to thank the Chinese Historical Society. I believe that if I hadn't have gone on that pilgrimage, we would not be working on this building today. It probably would not have hit my radar or as something that was really important. And so I think this is the importance of partnerships is partnerships allow us as Park Service employees to see things in new light. And as a Park Service employee, that is the richness. It's the richness of being with a partner and seeing something through their eyes and realizing that's important to them and I should respond to that. And so I really just appreciate all of the work from the Historical Society. I also want to give a shout out to a seasonal named John Jackson, who retired from the Park Service, I think 2 years ago now, but helped to create this wonderful partnership and help to see it happen year after year, as well as Yan Yan, who has contributed in so many ways. And I also, lastly, want to thank my incredible staff. We've had a lot of turnover in our staff through retirements, and I've got this up and coming young staff, and in particular, Adam Ramsey, who is the supervisor in Wawona, is just so passionate about this story. And we need those passionate leaders to continue moving these really important stories into the 2nd century. And of course, thank you to the Yosemite Conservancy. So thank you guys, appreciate being on the call today.
Thank you so much, Yan Yan and Sabrina. Before I introduce Hilda, I just want to take just a short moment to say that, you know, the National Park Service has incredible archaeologists and historians that have saved this information, have incredible interpreters and educators like Yan Yan, but also very importantly, management staff like Sabrina, who saw this change that the National Park Service need to make and had the initiative, had the leadership to make that change happen. So it's great. We're running a bit behind, but the program I think is great. So I hope everyone can continue to stay as we may be going about 10-15 minutes over. Next, you know, I mentioned at the beginning that the pilgrimage wanted to focus on a lot of untold stories. And the stories that are out there, we want to tell it better. And I'm so happy that we're able to work with other agencies and people that are outside of Yosemite as well. And so next I want to introduce Hilda, who's going to show us a quick trailer for a movie that just came out so well done with the U.S. Forest Service. So Hilda, please tell us about the trailer.
Great, thank you so much, Jack. Good morning, everyone. My name is Hilda Kwan. I work with the U.S. Forest Service as a hydrologist on the Mendocino National Forest in Northern California. And I wanted to just give a big thank you to the organizers for allowing me to take a few minutes to get you all interested in another virtual event that will happen next Saturday, August 8th, 12 p.m. Pacific time. The event will be similar to today's in examining the crossroads between public lands and Chinese American history. The Transcontinental Railroad passes over the Tahoe National Forest, and I suspect some, if not most of you, know of the work that the Chinese did going over or through the summit. The Forest Service produced a film last year called Legacy, discussing the laborious methods boring through the tunnels, as well as their significance in American history. And Dennis, if you'll play that short trailer, please.
Story of the Summit Tunnel. The Summit Tunnel itself, that term should be as compelling or evocative to us as when we hear the words, the Trail of Tears, or the Underground Railroad, or the Oregon Trail, or Route 66.
In the years after the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion. As the railroad was making progress, there was one really formidable barrier, and that was the 7,000-foot summit of the Sierra Nevada mountains.
the builders of the railroad realized they didn't have enough workers to do the thing. So they said, well, let's try the Chinese who are here mining or doing other things like this. And they started the crew right here in Auburn. They realized that the Chinese were such a great workforce.
Who else but Americans could drill 10 tunnels in mountains 30 feet deep in snow? Who else but Americans could chisel through miles of solid granite? A chapter in American history that belongs to the Chinese, and that a lot of it has to do with the construction of the Transcontinental and how the Transcontinental Railroad transformed this country.
Maybe this particular granite that I'm touching right now could be the same granite that my great-great-grandfather had touched.
This was the highest elevation tunnel ever built in the world at the time. They had to invent techniques to do this. And it was all done by hand. How could we do these things?
Thanks. You can go to the next slide. The event next week will feature a showing of this film. It's about 20 minutes long, but more interestingly, a panelist will also be featured. The people that you saw in the trailer just now, to further discuss the site's legacy and the current state of the site, which is still in dire need of protection. The panelists will include Ted Gong, Executive Director from the 1882 Foundation, Sue Lee, former Executive Director for the CHSA in San Francisco, Bill Sexton, Executive Director for the North Lake Tahoe Historical Society, as well as Alan Spears, Senior Director of Cultural Resources, Government Affairs for the National Parks and Conservation Association. And again, this event will be virtual next Saturday at noon, West Coast time, and I'll provide a link to the registration in the chat later on. And I hope you are interested and can take the time to join us. And I'll now return it back to Jack.
Thank you so much, Hilda. We're a little bit late, but you know, I learned that patience is something that's a real asset these days. And we left a very popular part of the pilgrimage, this year's pilgrimage, to the end, just like we saved the potluck to the end. So I'm going to turn this over to Paul Lee and Baylor Fong, who's going to give us this long-awaited program on how to deal with some food. Thank you. Paul.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jack. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Lee from San Mateo, California, and I have attended the pilgrimage every year except one. From its inception, there are highlights, moments that you remember and cherish. One of the favorites is the Saturday night potluck dinner. It's a time to share good food, getting reacquainted with old friends, and making new ones. It's been a tradition and something that everyone looks forward to. So while we're not meeting in person, we can still have a potluck of sorts, without the aromas and tastes, but more educational and instructive. Leading off is Bayard Fong with this much-awaited discussion about pickled green apricots. We'll also tell you about salted dried kingfish, known to many as ham yu. Many of us have delighted in these dishes, and now you'll learn the secrets. I'll then discuss a dish my grandmother prepared when I visited her during summers in Honolulu. I would always look forward to it because it was fun to eat, and being shared with many cousins and uncles brought great memories indeed. A classic Hawaiian treat, apia with tropical fruit compote. I call it Grandma's apia. So now let's begin with Bayard and his pickled green apricots and salted dried kingfish on you. Take it away, Bayard.
Thank you, Paul. Morning. Hi, my name is Bayard Fong. I'm a native of San Francisco. And actually, I wanted to appreciate this pilgrimage organization to helping pull this together. And I'd like to honor my great-grandfather, Fong Tuck, who came here in 1905 at the age of 28 and established our family here in the United States. I was recruited by our good friend Frank Ma in 2017 to come to bring my cooking experience to the Sing Peak Yosemite pilgrimage. At that time, I just retired from the City and County of San Francisco as an equal opportunity compliance officer in the Human Rights Commission. While growing up, I learned that to cook while helping my dad in his restaurant in Denver during my summers, where I'd visit him starting at the age of 13. In the 2017 pilgrimage, I prepared fresh rainbow trout, a main dish that Tai Sing had prepared with the Mather party. My recipe included fresh trout, vegetable oil with butter, salt and pepper, and sliced lemon. I enjoyed meeting and working with Jack Xu and Yin Yin Chan, U.S. Park Service, as well as the Tai Sing Pilgrimage Group. This year, I decided to attend the virtual pilgrimage and participate in bringing 2 other dishes to the table. As Paul mentioned, sort of an appetizer or fruit dish, pickled apricots, and also salted dried fish. So let me continue. Many foods that were needed for Tai Sing and many of the Chinese workers in the railroads, as well as in the Yosemite Valley, required having good solid food, meats, vegetables, fruits, to sustain themselves through the hard work, and especially in the winters while they were working up in the high Sierras where fresh fruit and fresh meat was not available. So drying foods and pickling foods, as well as salting foods, was so important. Growing up, my grandmother, Laura Lee Fong, and grandfather, Stephen Fong, prepared pickled green apricots and salted dried ham yu. Pickled green apricots. In those days, my family friends from whose Dak So family from Sunnyvale had a flower farm, and during the summer, they would bring out cut fruit and branches of peaches, apricots, and plums. And we would eat and get to taste the sweet fruit of the ripe fruit. But interestingly enough, I learned my grandparents would pickle the sour, not ripened fruits. And I'm going to present to you a little snippet about pickling apricots. Could roll the film for me? Thank you. All right, that's excellent. So I'm actually bringing before me a bottle of pickled green apricots. I'd like to share with everybody right now, but I think we have some logistical problems with that. Thank you very much. But I can't wait to open them up and taste them. Sour, sweet, crispy, fresh fruits, pickled fruits. Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to go to my second topic is Chinese American historians have written books about the Chinese fishing camps that have popped up around the Bay Area, and also about the lifeline from China of the fish to Sacramento, to San Francisco, and up to the Sierras, and through the rest of the states once the railroad lines were completed. Dried pink salted fish. These fish that you see here in this picture were caught just this last June off of Pacifica Pier. Kingfish were pretty common throughout this area. I remember when I was 7, grandmother would cook steamed rice in the pot and would put a small dish of dried ham yi in there and a couple of pieces of that. And then we'd, very oily and had a very kind of rich fermented taste to it. But it was delightful to go with rice, and we would eat a little bit of fish with a big scoop of rice. We should also supplement it typically with some fresh vegetables like bok choy or gailan or siu choy. And we would also sometimes prepare ham yi jing jiu, which is the salted fish with the minced pork. I remember at the age of 9, Uncle Bill taking me to go fishing off of the Muni Pier, and we would catch kingfish, sand dabs, perch, and rock cod. And later on, we would take little boats out of Mission Rock and be able to fish all day and catch a bucket full of fish. Too many fish to eat, too many fish to freeze, too many fish to give away. So my grandma and I would clean the fish, and she would salt them for a couple days in the fridge. And then Grandpa would make a structure out of wire and cheesecloth, and he would hang the fish in that wire pen, and we would put it in the back porch and let it just sit out there and dry out there. I'd like to roll that next film. Thank you. Okay, bringing it back to me again. So besides the nice fish that you see here, I have fresh ham yi, even a few more weeks drier than what you're seeing right there. And this morning I whipped up a dish of this ham yi jiu bang. Oh boy, who would like some of that? Okay. Anyway, with my delight, we were able to prepare these 2 dishes for you. I'm happy to share this recipe. And, you know, this pilgrimage has helped me get a closer feeling to my history of probably great-grandpa and grandpa and my dad as they were growing up in America all these years. Thank you very much. And I want to give special thanks to Paul Botro, who helped me with the videos. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Bayard. I'll now share with you Renma's Hapia, a Hawaiian coconut pudding. Just 5 simple ingredients: 1 14-ounce can of coconut milk, 4 tablespoons of sugar, 4 tablespoons of arrowroot. You can also substitute cornstarch, but the arrowroot produces a premier and a lighter texture and brings out the pronounced flavor of your coconut. 3/4 cup of water and 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. You take your coconut milk, mix it in, and I'm going to do a simulation. Take your coconut milk, mix it with your sugar, and heat and stir it constantly. And you stir until the lumps are gone. While you're waiting for this to boil, you take your arrowroot and your water and you mix it in a container. Again, mixing until all the arrowroot is dissolved and all the lumps are gone. While this is heating up, you wait for it to boil, your coconut milk, and once it boils, you'll add the arrowroot and the water mixture, stirring constantly. Once you reached a creamy and thick texture, you can turn down the heat and then add your teaspoonful of vanilla extract. Once you get a more creamy and thick mixture, you can turn off the heat, pour it into a 8x8 pan like this, and cover it and allow it to refrigerate it for at least 3 hours. I typically do it for overnight. And while I'm doing that, when I'm waiting for it to chill, I work on a fruit compote. For today, I have papaya and coconut, papaya, mango, kiwi, and strawberries. And I like to add blueberries. I mix all of this into a mixing container, gently, of course. All the while, the papaya mix is chilling in the refrigerator. Now you can add pineapple. You can also use passion fruit, strawberries, bananas, anything that you would like to add as a fruit compote. Mix it gently. And once the papaya has chilled thoroughly, this is the finished product, and that comes out nice and thick and creamy. Now it's ready to serve. You want to slice this into squares. Garnish with your fruit compote. And voila, you have a classic Hawaiian dish. Now, this recipe was passed to my grandmother, to my mother, and now to me. And I'm preparing it now for my grandson, who just loves it, and it's so simple to prepare. Mahalo and enjoy.
So, Paul and Baylor, this is totally not fair. This is totally not fair that at this pilgrimage, we only get to see how it's prepared, how great it looks, and we don't, Zoom has a lot of advantages. It's a great program. A lot of people from across the country can participate. It's recorded, but it's not fair. This isn't good enough. We have to be able to eat this, and that's why the pilgrimage has to continue, so we could not only see you and learn about these recipes, but to actually taste them. So we can go on to the next portion of the program. I guess there's another slide as we close out and get ready for our question and answer. These are sites that are available to everyone to learn more about the Historical Society, the National Park Service, the API Heritage Collaborative, the National Park Service, National Parks and Conservation Association, and many others. So please take note of these websites and that you can get a lot more resources and information at them. We're ready for our question and answer period. We have about 10 minutes to go, so I'm going to rely on some other folks that are we're going to open the chat box and answer a few questions that you may have. And I think I'm going to ask for people to drop in their questions into the chat box. While I have a chance to speak here for a few minutes, real quickly, there is a small group of us that are going to go to Sing Peak, the pilgrimage, the hiking and backpacking pilgrimage, which is meant for experienced backpackers. So that part of the pilgrimage will continue this year. This is year 8, and I plan on doing that for at least another 2 years. So let me start with the first question from Audrey Lee. What are the anticipated public opening tour hours for the Chinese laundry when restoration is complete? Will there be an interpretive ranger on site? So I'm going to let Yan Yan answer that question.
Thank you. So our anticipated opening will be this fall or late fall. It is dependent on the COVID-19 crisis, but we should be finished with the exhibit later this year. And it's also dependent on having someone there. We may either use volunteers to be in the exhibit so that there's always someone there. And we also have interpretive rangers on site in Wawona, so there may be an interpretive ranger in the space as well. But at this moment, we're planning on sometime late fall to have it be completed and open.
Thank you, Yan. And I'll add that what Sabrina had explained earlier, the National Park Service is changing and updating the ways it interprets and talks about these places, not only in terms of content, but also in methodology. So what she explained, having questions on those plates, making them more interactive. These interpretive education facilities are for everyone. We want a much larger, diverse group of people to visit these places and learn about this part of Yosemite's history. Well, another question from Lena and Steve. Will we get to get the Zoom video to share with our families? And yes, Dennis, you want to tell us how that's going to be done?
Yes. If you, actually, let me go back to the previous slide here. If you registered for this program via the Yosemite singpeak@gmail.com email address, you'll automatically be sent the link to the recording for this program. As well, I believe there's a question about the recipes. We'll go ahead and send those out to that as well. If you did not RSVP through that email, please send an email address to, an email message to this address, and we'll make sure to get the information out to you.
Great. Also on the chat box, I mentioned there's a link to the presentation this coming Saturday on the 8th that Hilda mentioned. So you can catch that if you actually click that and save that link, that'll be great. So again, any questions you could place onto the chat box. Any other, we have a minute or two, any closing statements from any of the speakers that have spoke earlier, Eugene and Annette, Rich?
Oh, I do want to make mention one thing. When we end the program, there is a poll that we're asking participants to partake in. It's a quick evaluation about today's program, as well as questions about if you're interested in additional information. So please take the poll at the end of the program.
So there's a question with regards to volunteers and others that can work in Wawona, perhaps at this laundry to further help its interpretation. The National Park Service does have a pretty good system of having volunteers help these education and interpretive programs, presenting them to the public. And I don't know if all that, yeah, maybe you know if there's any plans working with the interpretive staff to make that happen at the laundry facility.
I think those are really wonderful ideas. I think, yes, we'll definitely look into that. The Park Service receives so much support from volunteers. So anyone who's interested in volunteering, that would make it so much better for the place to be open during daytime hours for the public. So stay tuned.
Yeah. The other part of the laundry story is Wawona has a very diverse story. And one of the things that have come out in the last 10, 20 years is that the Buffalo Soldiers were in Wawona. They were the first folks, the federal troops that guarded the national parks. And the Buffalo Soldiers in Wawona, one of the lieutenants there, we believe, actually built the first, what we would now call nature trail on what is now a national parks. At the time, it was called an arboretum. So I think we want to talk about that story as well. In terms of pilgrimages for the future, I certainly hope we're out of this pandemic next year and that we'll have a real pilgrimage so that we'll be able to see each other, share a lot more food, tell more stories, and have an in-depth look at what's happening with the laundry facilities, seeing one of the great successes of the pilgrimage, and looking at the exhibits that Sabrina talked about so well. I really want to be able to see not only the artwork, I guess ultimately to see the public walk into that facility and actually learn more about the Chinese American history in the park, as well as then get into engaging in more critical thinking and talking about, if they simply talk about how important meals are to families, that'll be wonderful. That'll be really great. Checking if we have any other questions. I think that's pretty much to a close. I don't see anything else. Okay, so the children's book that we mentioned at the beginning of the book was by Annette Pimentel, Mountain Chef. So that's available in various places to get books. It's a great gift. Just a hint, if you have children, grandchildren, people who are friends and that have children of that age, it's a wonderful book.
I also see a question from Sandra regarding the builders section, to put a touch screen for visitors to interact with the map of the Chinese building the roads. So that's a wonderful suggestion. We'll definitely think about how we can incorporate that.
That's great. Dennis, you have any last minute things before we sign off? We're actually approaching our drop dead cutoff time of an hour and a half.
I have nothing to add except to say that NPCA feels so privileged to be part of this partnership. We look forward to continuing to work with the Chinese Historical Society, with the Park Service, and all the other partners to make sure the story is told and make sure more people know about it. Again, that our national parks tell the stories of all Americans.
Actually want to see if we could take a group picture.
Oh, okay.
If we can have all the speakers turn on their video real quick, we'd like to take a group shot.
If you could stop sharing your screen, Dennis.
Also, if we didn't get to your questions, we will be saving the chat box, and we'll try to answer your questions via email afterward. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to take a photo, everyone, so smile.
I'll smile.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
And just one last thanks to NPCA. This Zoom event was the most successful ones I've participated in. It was not easy. There was a large team of NPCA staff that worked tirelessly up until a few minutes before we started to make sure that it all went smoothly. A lot of support people, a lot of people that worked on the technical aspects of using Zoom. So I'm so happy that we're able to have such a successful event, a successful pilgrimage, virtual pilgrimage. So thank you, NPCA, National Park Service, Historical Societies of Southern California. This has really been a great event, a great pilgrimage for this year. we'll have to have one, of course, next year in person.